confessed that she had obtained a pistol with the intent to kill her son and herself, and that she shot him several times while he was sleeping in his bed. She then laid down with him because he was still alive, was caressing him, and he was calling out her name, saying, "Mommy, Mommy."
Prosecutors say even after shooting her teenage son, the suspect didn't stop there.
She went to the kitchen, got a kitchen knife, came back to the bedroom, and then stabbed her son to make sure that he would die.
Welcome to Shocking True Crime. Thanks to all our viewers and subscribers for your support. Stay with us for daily updates on the most shocking true crime stories. Don't forget to subscribe.
In the heart of Missouri, where quiet streets and trimmed lawns promise safety, a single house would shatter that illusion. Behind its doors, time stopped. Days passed, unanswered calls mounted, and a silence grew heavy enough to draw the attention of those who knew something was wrong. Friends are worried. Neighbors sensed nothing. Police would soon arrive, only to find that inside, something irreversible had taken place. A discovery so shocking, it would echo through the entire community and beyond. What unfolded on Lightfoot Drive is a story of love betrayed, of trust broken in the most unthinkable way. It is a case that forces us to ask the hardest of questions: how well do we really know the people closest to us? Tonight, we revisit those final days. A home filled with silence, a boy whose laughter no longer answered the phone, and a truth so devastating that even the investigators who uncovered it still carry its weight. This is not just a crime, it is a reckoning. And it begins here. He was only 16. A teenager on the cusp of everything: first loves, small victories on the basketball court, hours lost to video games, and laughter that seemed to echo through every room he entered. His name was Marcus Roy, and to those who knew him best, he wasn't just a friend, he was light, energy, and possibility wrapped into one young life. Marcus's friends remember him as the one who kept spirits high when things went quiet. He had a way of disarming people with kindness, of making you feel like you belonged, even if you didn't believe it yourself. Teachers described him as optimistic, a boy who asked questions with curiosity rather than fear of being wrong. In his neighborhood, his name carried warmth, an impression of a teenager with a future stretched wide in front of him. On the basketball court, Marcus thrived. He wasn't the tallest or the strongest, but his energy made up for it. He laughed when he missed a shot and laughed louder when he made one, pulling his friends into moments that felt bigger than the game. Off the court, his joy transferred into other passions. He loved his video games, loved the hours spent arguing over who was better at them, and he loved the long, aimless nights hanging out with friends, plotting futures that still seemed possible. To understand Marcus is to see how he connected people. Friends recall his messages, his jokes, his unshakable presence at school and after. He was the one you wanted on your side, not because he was tough, but because he cared. He asked how you were, meant it, and remembered your answer. Kindness was not something he performed, it was the way he moved through the world, the quiet glue that held his circle together. Friday night, September 26, 2025, would be the last night Marcus's friends saw him alive. They met up, the way teenagers always do, without grand planning, without ceremony. Just the usual mix of late-night laughter, fast food wrappers, and conversations that lingered past midnight. They talked about school, about girls, about video games, and about life after high school. For Marcus, every word carried the hope of more to come. By 2 a.m., the night wound down. One friend offered him a ride, and Marcus climbed into the passenger seat. Streetlights blurred past, the city settling into silence as teenagers navigated the familiar drive home. They pulled up to his house on Lightfoot Drive, and Marcus waved, stepping out into the cool night air. There was nothing unusual. Nothing alarming. Just a boy heading into his home, the front door closing behind him. His friends thought nothing of it. Why would they? For them, it was simply another Friday night that bled into Saturday morning. No one knew they had just watched the last chapter of his life begin to close. No one thought the laughter they shared would never return. No one imagined that those small, ordinary goodbyes were final. It is this truth that lingers in every corner of this case, the fragility of moments we take for granted. The friend who dropped Marcus off later told investigators that he tried calling him all weekend. Call after call went unanswered. Messages remained unread. For someone like Marcus, who was never far from his friends, never out of reach for long, this silence was deafening. At first, it was shrugged off, maybe he was busy, maybe he needed space. But as the hours turned into days, and the familiar voice remained absent, unease set in. And it's here where this story forces us to look inward. When was the last time you said goodbye to someone you loved, never knowing it was the last time? When did you last assume there would always be another call, another text, another chance? Marcus's friends are haunted by this question. They still replay that final ride, that final wave, wondering if there was something they missed, something they could have seen in his eyes, some hidden signal that might have warned them of what was to come. But there was nothing. There was only Marcus, the boy who loved life, stepping back into his home. A home his friends believed to be safe. A home they could never imagine would transform into the setting of a tragedy so profound it would shake their community to its core. What unfolded after that Friday night is the story of silence, unanswered phones, and growing dread. But in this first chapter, we remember Marcus as he was, the boy who made others laugh when life felt heavy, the teenager who loved basketball, video games, and the simple company of friends. His kindness was real, his optimism infectious, and his presence unforgettable. For Marcus, that night ended like any other. For his friends, it became the night they unknowingly said goodbye forever. While Marcus Roy's life was marked by warmth and connection, the portrait of his mother, Cassandra Roy, tells a very different story. At 47, she was a woman who seemed to drift on the edges of her own life, a figure more shadow than presence. To outsiders, she was difficult to understand. Neighbors described her as strange, withdrawn, and always a step removed from the rhythm of the community. Those who lived nearby often saw her, but rarely with her son, rarely in ways that suggested the closeness most expect between a mother and child. The distance was noticed, but never deeply questioned. After all, families often guard their struggles behind closed doors. Cassandra's past carried its own fractures. She had endured a troubled marriage, one marked by instability and eventual separation. The fallout left scars that were not visible but lived beneath her quiet demeanor. While some parents pour themselves into their children during times of hardship, Cassandra seemed to retreat further. Marcus, by most accounts, was raised as much by the love of his friends and his own resilient spirit as by the woman who gave him life. Her minimal involvement in his daily routines became a fact of life, something his friends whispered about, something his neighbors noted when they saw him outside, vibrant and full of energy, while his mother remained inside. Isolation became Cassandra's defining trait. In a neighborhood where porches carried conversations and families waved across lawns, she stood apart. Her curtains often stayed drawn, her footsteps rarely echoed beyond her own walls, and her presence at community events was nearly non-existent. Some neighbors said she carried herself with a heaviness, as though the world outside her front door had little to offer her. Others admitted they never really knew her at all. She was there, and yet not there, a silhouette in the background of a boy's brighter story. Psychologists often say that silence is not the absence of feeling but the weight of it. Cassandra's silence seemed to hide something deeper, something she never openly shared. There were whispers of her struggles, hints that depression lingered in her life, wrapping around her days like an unshakable fog. Depression has many faces, it can be quiet, invisible, and unnoticed by those who do not look closely. For Cassandra, it appeared as detachment. For Marcus, it meant a mother who seemed absent even when she was in the same room. The resentment of a broken marriage, the loneliness of her isolation, and the unspoken weight of her mental state may have fermented into something darker, something that altered the way she saw herself and her son. As the weeks rolled into September of 2025, signs of Cassandra's erratic behavior began to surface. She became unpredictable in small, unsettling ways. Friends of Marcus remembered that she seemed more distracted, more distant, as though she was wrestling with something invisible but consuming. Neighbors noticed small changes, too, her coming and going at odd hours, her face carrying the kind of exhaustion that no sleep could fix. To most, these signs were brushed off.
Welcome to Shocking True Crime. Thanks to all our viewers and subscribers for your support. Stay with us for daily updates on the most shocking true crime stories. Don't forget to subscribe.
People explained it away as stress, or the remnants of a life lived in fragments after her marriage fell apart. Yet beneath those explanations lay something far more dangerous. Foreshadowing is often only visible in hindsight. In the days before the tragedy, Cassandra's choices hinted at intent that no one could have imagined. Retrieving a firearm from her ex-husband's home, isolating herself further, and withdrawing into silence were pieces of a puzzle that would only make sense after the crime had already unfolded. At the time, however, they were small signals buried in the noise of everyday life. To those around her, she was still the same distant figure, strange, quiet, and aloof. To herself, she may have already been rehearsing the steps that would alter her son's future forever. The paradox of Cassandra Roy lies in the duality of her role. To the outside world, she was a mother in name but not in presence. To Marcus, she was the distant figure who carried the title of parent but not the warmth. And yet, beneath that distance, there remained the undeniable truth: she was his mother, the one person expected to protect him when the world grew harsh. This contradiction, of absence alongside responsibility, of silence alongside expectation, forms the unsettling core of her story. It leaves us to question how detachment, resentment, and despair can twist into violence when left unchallenged for too long. As investigators would later piece together, Cassandra's mask had been slipping for some time. Her detachment was not merely a quirk of personality but the early cracks of something collapsing within. The subtle changes in her behavior were not random, they were the foreshadowing of decisions already taking shape in her mind. To her friends and neighbors, she was a strange woman living on the edges of her own community. To Marcus, she was the mother whose silence had grown louder with every passing year. And to the story that would soon unfold, she was the central figure in a tragedy that no one thought possible until it was too late. In examining Cassandra Roy, we find not only a mother but a study of isolation itself, a portrait of how distance, depression, and resentment can hollow out the human spirit until only fragments remain. Her life, seen through the eyes of others, seemed quiet, detached, and strange. But quiet is not harmless. Detached is not safe. And strange is not always benign. For Cassandra, the months leading into September 2025 were not random, they were the final, silent steps toward a decision that would forever destroy her son's story and leave her community asking how no one saw it coming. The weekend began quietly, the kind of late September lull when teenagers settle back into the rhythm of school, sports, and friendships. For Marcus Roy's circle of friends, it should have been no different. But by Saturday morning, something felt off. Texts were sent, calls were made, messages stacked one after another, none of them answered. At first, it was easy to dismiss. Maybe Marcus had overslept. Maybe his phone had died. Teenagers vanish into their own worlds all the time, caught between homework and video games, between family and friends. But with Marcus, silence was unusual. He was the one who responded, the one who picked up, the one who never stayed away long. As hours turned into Saturday evening, the unease grew. His closest friends remembered refreshing their phones, waiting for the small icon of his name to light up. By Sunday morning, that unease had hardened into worry. Calls rolled straight to voicemail. Messages went unread. A boy who thrived on connection had suddenly cut all ties, and the absence felt heavier than anyone could explain. They told themselves he might be grounded, or busy, or distracted, but deep down, something did not feel right. They knew him too well to believe this was ordinary. By late Sunday night, concern had turned to dread. One friend, who had dropped Marcus off at his house just after 2 a.m. on Friday, felt it most. He replayed the moment again and again, Marcus stepping out of the car, the short wave, the front door closing behind him. That was the last time anyone saw him. Now, more than 2 days had passed. Every attempt to reach him had failed. And that ordinary goodbye began to feel like a warning, though no one could say why. Monday morning, the silence grew unbearable. Friends who were once hopeful now became insistent. Something was wrong, and they knew it. They reached out to authorities, voices shaking as they explained that Marcus was missing contact for days, a break from his usual life that was so extreme it demanded action. They requested a welfare check at his home on Lightfoot Drive. Their worry was not rooted in suspicion of a crime, but in the love of friends who refused to ignore the weight of silence any longer. When officers from the St. Charles Police Department arrived at the house, they noticed something immediately. The air carried a foul odor, seeping from behind the closed doors and shuttered windows. To trained responders, smell is a language of its own, a sign that time has passed where it should not have, that something inside is terribly wrong. The home appeared still, but not in a peaceful way. The silence was thick, heavy enough to make even seasoned officers pause before stepping inside. Neighbors watched quietly as patrol cars parked along the street, lights reflecting off the houses of a community that prided itself on safety. They saw officers approach the door, knock, wait, and then force their way in. What they entered was not chaos, but a kind of suffocating stillness. The smell grew stronger, guiding them toward a room where curtains were drawn and the air barely moved. It was in that silence, inside that bedroom, that the truth of Marcus Roy's absence finally revealed itself. What the officers discovered inside would haunt them forever. It was not the scene of a boy who had simply left home, nor a teenager avoiding calls. It was something darker, more permanent, and more horrifying than anyone waiting outside could have imagined. The officers stepped into the house, and at once the air told its own story. It was thick, sour, and heavy, pressing down on every breath. Curtains were drawn tight, sealing the rooms in dim light, turning what should have been a safe family home into a chamber of silence. The stillness was overwhelming, broken only by the creak of floorboards as they moved cautiously through the narrow hallways. Each step pulled them deeper into an atmosphere that felt wrong, an emptiness that carried the weight of something irreversible. They scanned the living room, the kitchen, the small dining space. Nothing stirred. No sound of footsteps, no voice calling back to meet them. The odor guided their path, intensifying as they moved toward the bedroom. For experienced first responders, the smell was familiar, and familiarity brought dread. It was the unmistakable mark of death, a signal that the call for a welfare check had become something far darker. Every sense told them they were not walking into a rescue but into a discovery they would carry long after they left. The door to Marcus Roy's bedroom stood closed. The handle turned, the hinges groaned, and inside, the silence deepened. A teenager's room, ordinary in so many ways, yet pierced by the extraordinary violence that had taken place there. Posters clung to the walls, a pair of sneakers sat neatly near the bed, belongings scattered in the way only a 16-year-old boy could leave them. But on the bed itself, motionless and pale, lay Marcus. His body was still, his presence now only a shell of the life that had once filled the space. The sight was immediate and devastating. Marcus bore the evidence of multiple gunshot wounds, his body pierced again and again. Yet the horror did not end there. Investigators soon saw the unmistakable marks of stabbing layered onto his injuries, evidence of a second assault carried out with chilling intent. The combination was shocking not only for its brutality but for its persistence, an execution that went far beyond a single act of violence. It told a story of determination, of someone unwilling to stop until the boy's life was fully taken. The scene bore its own testimony. On the nightstand, investigators found ballistic casings, each one a reminder of the shots that tore through the quiet of that room. Near the foot of the bed, a knife rested, its blade stained in deep red, the edges crusted from use. There were no signs of forced entry, no struggle that spread beyond the confines of the bed. It was contained, deliberate, and chillingly precise. The violence was not random. It was controlled. Someone who belonged in the home had carried it out, and they had done so with the coldness of execution. Forensics would later map the violence in methodical detail, each wound logged, each trace of blood examined. The patterns told investigators that Marcus had been attacked while he slept, defenseless in the one place he should have been most protected. The gunshots came first, tearing into him as he lay beneath his blanket, startled awake into a nightmare. And when he did not die quickly enough, the knife was brought forward, finishing what the bullets began. The precision was staggering, the cruelty undeniable. It was a killing defined not by rage in the moment, but by choice, by continuation. The officers on scene, hardened by years of service, carried the weight of what they saw. It is one thing to witness death on the street, in accidents, or in acts of random violence. It is another to find a child murdered in his own bed, surrounded by the simple evidence of a teenage life, schoolwork, sneakers, video games, and a future that had been stolen. In their official reports they wrote facts, times, and evidence. But what they carried away, beyond the paperwork, was the memory of a boy whose life had ended where he should have felt most safe. The words echoed later in hushed voices, he died where he should have been safest, in his own bed. That truth cut deeper than the wounds they recorded. It was the betrayal of innocence, the violation of trust, the destruction of a place meant for rest and protection. And as the scene was documented, photographed, and sealed for investigation, the silence of Lightfoot Drive seemed to grow heavier. A boy was gone, his story violently ended, and the people tasked with uncovering the truth now faced the question of who could commit such a deliberate act against him, and why. With the crime scene secured, detectives began the work of piecing together a life cut short. The first step was to speak with those who knew Marcus best, his friends.
Welcome to Shocking True Crime. Thanks to all our viewers and subscribers for your support. Stay with us for
Their
daily
voices
updates on
carried
the most
grief and
shocking true
disbelief,
crime stories.
but also clarity.
Don't forget to subscribe.
They insisted Marcus was not the kind of boy who would give up on life. He was full of laughter, always looking forward, never weighed down by despair. He loved life, one friend told investigators, repeating it over and over as if saying it enough times might rewrite what had just been discovered. For the detectives, that testimony mattered. It ruled out one path of explanation: this was no suicide, no self-inflicted tragedy. Someone had done this to him. As the conversations deepened, the image of Marcus grew sharper. His friends remembered how he always answered messages, how he was never unreachable for long. They spoke about the Friday night they last saw him, when he stayed out with them until after 2 a.m. They described his good mood, his easy laughter, and the ordinariness of the night. Nothing in his words or actions hinted at danger, at despair, or at fear of going home. This was a boy expecting another day, another weekend, another tomorrow. And yet, by Monday, tomorrow had been stolen from him forever. But as investigators turned the focus outward, toward the one person closest to him, the story shifted. Marcus's friends hesitated when asked about his mother, Cassandra Roy. Their answers were careful at first, but then honest. They described her as disconnected, distant, and unsettling. She was rarely involved in her son's daily life. She did not come to games, did not show up to school events, did not weave herself into the rhythm of his friendships. She lingered on the edge of Marcus's world, present only by title, absent in practice. To them, she was strange, a word they chose more than once, struggling to explain a feeling that had always been there but had never made sense, until now. Detectives listened carefully. In many investigations, the first circle of suspicion spreads outward, looking for intruders, strangers, or predators hiding in the dark. But here, there were no signs of forced entry. No broken locks. No shattered windows. Nothing had been taken. Everything pointed inward. The evidence inside the house, the ballistic casings, the bloodied knife, the confined violence within the bedroom, spoke of someone who lived there, someone who belonged behind those walls. The realization settled in with a chill. This was not the work of an outsider. The danger had come from within the very home meant to protect Marcus. The timeline sharpened as detectives reconstructed the days. Marcus was last seen alive in the early hours of Saturday, September 27th. By then, the weapon had already been retrieved from Cassandra's ex-husband's home. Friends called all weekend, left unanswered messages, tried again and again. On Monday, the odor gave away what silence had concealed. In just 3 days, the bright life of a teenager had ended, and the small signals, the missing calls, the strange distance of a mother, the drawn curtains, became devastating in hindsight. The investigators paused, reflecting on the testimony stacking up before them. How many times, the narrator's voice asks, have warning signs been ignored until it's too late? How many silences dismissed as quirks, how many absences explained away, before tragedy finally breaks through the walls? It is a question as old as crime itself, and in Marcus's case, the answer carried unbearable weight. His friends had noticed the strangeness, had felt the distance, but never imagined it would lead here. Neighbors had seen a woman isolated, but isolation rarely screams danger, until it does. As the pieces fell together, the suspicion that began as a whisper now grew louder. The facts no longer pointed into the shadows of strangers but into the quiet figure of Cassandra Roy herself. Her distance from her son was no longer just unusual, it was part of a chilling puzzle, one that investigators knew they would soon confront. The evidence had begun to speak, and every word pointed back to the woman who should have been Marcus's protector. The mask was slipping, and the truth was coming into view. As detectives worked the crime scene, documenting every wound, every trace of blood, another revelation surfaced. On that very same day Marcus's body was discovered, his mother, Cassandra Roy, had attempted to take her own life. Emergency responders had found her alive but in critical condition, a woman who appeared to be unraveling under the weight of choices she had already made. She was rushed to the hospital, stabilized, and placed under care. For investigators, this was not just another detail, it was a sign of a deeper collapse, a fracture between guilt and determination, and it forced them to ask whether her attempt was born of regret or simply the final step in a plan that had already gone too far. For hours, Cassandra lay in the hospital under observation. Police waited, watching from the edges, knowing that when she was released, questions would demand answers. They wondered what her state of mind would reveal. Would they meet a woman hysterical with grief, overcome by what she had done? Or would they face someone colder, someone resigned to her own destruction and the destruction she left behind? When she was finally discharged, she did not look broken in the way some had expected. Instead, she seemed quiet, detached, almost eerily calm, as if the storm had already passed and she was left only with the silence it created. The drive from the hospital to the station was marked by that silence. Officers who transported her later described the mood as unsettling, not frantic, not desperate, but flat. Cassandra did not weep. She did not beg. She did not rage against the accusations waiting for her. She sat with the stillness of someone who already knew the script of what was to come. For law enforcement officers familiar with crime and grief, that quiet carried its own kind of weight. It was not the silence of denial, it was the silence of acceptance. At the police station, the formalities began. Detectives explained her rights, laying out the words meant to protect her in questioning. Cassandra listened, nodded, and then, without hesitation, waived them. She voluntarily gave up her right to remain silent, her right to counsel, her right to refuse. It was a decision that startled even the seasoned investigators sitting across from her. Many suspects, especially in cases of this magnitude, cling to those protections. But Cassandra seemed ready, as if she wanted the burden she carried to finally be spoken aloud. That calm resignation chilled the room even before she began to speak. Interrogations are not only about words but about posture, tone, and presence. Cassandra's demeanor gave the impression of a woman untethered, no longer connected to the fear of consequence. Her eyes remained steady, her voice did not waver. She was neither frantic nor combative. Instead, she answered questions with a kind of eerie composure that unsettled the detectives who listened. It was as though she had rehearsed her admissions, as though the act of confessing was not a struggle but an inevitability. The human instinct for self-preservation seemed absent, replaced by a kind of weary surrender. The detectives leaned in, asking carefully, guiding her back through the weekend, back through the decisions that had led to the crime scene they had just left. Cassandra followed, step by step, as if retracing a path she had already walked countless times in her mind. Each answer came without hesitation. Each detail seemed to weigh heavier than the last. For the officers, the puzzle pieces were finally about to fit together, but what they were about to hear would cut deeper than evidence, deeper than forensic detail. It would expose intent, motive, and cruelty in a way that even they were not fully prepared for. And then came the moment that shifted the room. Cassandra began to describe, in her own words, what had happened inside that house, what had unfolded in the silence of Lightfoot Drive. What she said next stunned even the most seasoned investigators. In the quiet of the interrogation room, Cassandra Roy finally began to speak. What came out was not denial, not confusion, but a series of statements so matter-of-fact that even seasoned detectives shifted in their chairs. She started at the beginning, tracing her steps back to Friday. Days before her son's body was discovered, she had gone to her ex-husband's home and retrieved a firearm. It was not a spontaneous act, she admitted, but a deliberate one. She said she carried the weapon back to her house with a plan already formed. The intent, she explained, was not only to end her son's life but to end her own as well. The officers listened in silence, realizing this was not just a crime of impulse, it was premeditation. When asked why, Cassandra's answer carried no tremor of doubt. She said she intended to kill Marcus and then herself, as if the two acts were bound together in her mind. There was no attempt to soften the truth or hide behind excuses. To her, the plan had been complete. But the reality that followed was messier, crueler, and far more devastating. Forensic evidence had already painted a picture of violence, but Cassandra's own words gave that picture a voice. It was not a stranger who had crept into Marcus's room. It was his mother, standing over him as he slept, carrying a gun she had carefully sought out days before. She described climbing into his bed while he was still asleep. She lay beside him, the way mothers do with children much younger, her presence both intimate and menacing. Then, without warning, she raised the firearm and pulled the trigger. Once. Twice. Again and again. The bullets tore through the silence of the room, shattering the stillness of night. Marcus stirred, startled awake into a horror no child should ever face. He cried out, his voice breaking through the noise, calling the only word he knew to reach for in that moment, Mommy. Detectives noted that Cassandra did not flinch when she said this. She recounted the moment with the same tone as the rest, as if the cry of her son had not pierced her but merely confirmed the suffering she claimed she wanted to end. Marcus, though wounded, did not die immediately. He clung to life, crying, breathing, his body struggling to hold on. Cassandra admitted she stayed beside him, watching his pain, hearing his voice call out for her. Yet instead of mercy in the form of care, or remorse, or an ambulance, her next decision sealed his fate. She told investigators she rose from the bed and walked into the kitchen. There, she opened a drawer, pulled out a knife, and returned to her son's side. In her words, she needed to finish what the bullets could not. She leaned over him, and in those final moments, the violence escalated. The blade struck where the gunfire had not ended his suffering. Cassandra confessed to stabbing Marcus, telling the officers she did it to put him out of his pain. The cruelty of the act and the coldness of her delivery left the room heavy with silence. For detectives, it was not only the brutality that shocked them, it was her detachment. They pressed further, asking the question that lingered in the air. Did you want to kill him? One investigator asked, giving her one last chance to hesitate, to retreat, to reveal even a flicker of remorse. Cassandra's answer came quickly, without pause, her voice flat and certain. Yeah, she said. A single word, delivered without the weight one might expect, and yet carrying a gravity that would echo in every corner of the courtroom to come. The confession was recorded, transcribed, and preserved as evidence. To those listening, it was not simply a recounting of events, it was a chilling admission that laid bare the mind of a mother who had chosen destruction over protection. For investigators, it confirmed what the crime scene had already told them. But for Marcus's friends and community, when these details were revealed later, it was almost too much to comprehend. A boy who loved life, who dreamed of tomorrow, had called out for his mother with his final breath, and she had answered not with comfort, but with violence. When news of Marcus Roy's death spread, it hit his friends first. They were the ones who had called and texted all weekend, the ones who pleaded with police to check the house on Lightfoot Drive. Now they carried the unbearable truth that their instincts were right. Marcus was gone. The boy who made them laugh when the world felt heavy, the one who always picked up the phone, was silenced in the most violent way imaginable. Their grief came with guilt, replaying the unanswered calls, replaying the ride home on Friday night. Every detail of their last moments with him became a haunting memory they could not escape. For the wider community, disbelief was the first reaction. Neighbors on Lightfoot Drive stood in small clusters, speaking in hushed tones, unable to understand how such horror could happen inside a house that looked like any other. They remembered Marcus's energy, his polite greetings, his presence at the basketball court. They struggled to reconcile that bright spirit with the crime now tied to his family's address. But disbelief quickly turned to grief, and grief soon gave way to anger, because the accused was not a stranger. It was his own mother. The betrayal cut deeper than the crime itself. Communities can rally when tragedy comes from outside, when danger enters from beyond their borders. But this was different. The wound came from within, from the very person who was supposed to guard Marcus's life. How does a community grieve, the narrator asks, when the wound comes from within its own? The question lingered in churches, in schools, in living rooms where families talked late into the night about how something like this could happen. No answer felt big enough to contain the loss. Marcus's funeral was filled with faces both young and old, each carrying a different kind of sorrow. His friends sat together in the front rows, holding back tears that often spilled anyway. Teachers came, speaking softly about a student who had once filled their classrooms with curiosity. The basketball team lined up in their jerseys, heads bowed, their silence saying more than words ever could. In the pulpit, the pastor spoke of a life ended too soon, of questions left without answers, of faith stretched thin in the face of cruelty. He asked the community to lean on each other, but even as he spoke, the weight in the room was almost too much to bear. At the graveside, silence again took over. The casket lowered into the earth seemed to pull with it every smile, every laugh, every dream Marcus once carried. Friends clutched each other, some unable to stand without leaning into another's arms. Parents held their own children closer, shaken by the reminder that safety is never guaranteed. And through it all, the question of Cassandra hung unspoken in the air. How could she do this? What kind of pain or darkness could turn a mother against her child? No prayer could fully cover that wound. No sermon could erase the betrayal. Neighbors who had once dismissed Cassandra as strange now carried their own burden of regret. They replayed the times they saw her isolated, the moments they wondered about her distance. Could something have been said? Could someone have reached her before the silence turned deadly? These reflections carried no answers, only the ache of hindsight. The guilt was not theirs to bear, but in tragedies like this, communities often shoulder it anyway. It was easier to blame themselves than to accept the unfathomable truth, that a mother had made a choice no one could undo. The pain of losing a child is already unbearable. But when that loss is caused by the very person entrusted to protect them, it shatters more than one life. It fractures trust, it poisons memory, it leaves survivors unsure of where safety begins and ends. For Marcus's friends, the betrayal was personal. They could not reconcile the loving boy they knew with the violence that had come from his own home. For the community, the betrayal was collective. It forced them to confront the fragility of the bonds they had assumed unbreakable. In the days and weeks that followed, unanswered prayers filled the air. Vigils were held, candles lit, names whispered into the night. But even in unity, the loss felt raw. Broken trust is not easily repaired. The community stood together, but beneath their shared mourning lay a wound too deep to fully close. Marcus Roy was gone, taken not by illness, not by accident, not by a stranger's hand, but by the one person whose love should have been certain. And that truth left scars across Lightfoot Drive that no amount of time could erase. In the days that followed Cassandra Roy's confession, the case moved swiftly from shock to prosecution. The St. Charles County authorities wasted no time in filing charges. Cassandra was officially indicted on 1 count of first-degree murder and 1 count of armed criminal action. The weight of the charges reflected not only the brutality of the act but the cold deliberation that preceded it. She was no longer simply a mother under suspicion. She was now a defendant in the eyes of the law, accused of premeditated murder against her own child. The reality of those words struck like a hammer through the community, a mother, charged with intentionally taking the life of her 16-year-old son. The court set her bond at $1 million, cash only. For most, that figure was symbolic more than practical. It was a statement of the severity of the crime, a declaration that this was not a case where freedom, even temporarily, could be risked. Cassandra remained behind bars, awaiting the next steps in a process that promised to be as complex as it was painful. Her cell became the final echo of her isolation, a stark contrast to the life she had once lived on Lightfoot Drive. The woman who had once drawn her curtains and withdrawn from her neighbors now sat in a space where every move was watched and every choice was no longer her own. Prosecutors built their case with confidence, pointing first to premeditation. The evidence was clear: Cassandra had retrieved a firearm from her ex-husband's home before the murder. That act alone, they argued, destroyed any claim that her actions were spontaneous or born of temporary madness. She had armed herself days before Marcus's final night, carrying the weapon into her home with intent already formed. Legal experts reviewing the case agreed, premeditation would be difficult to dispute. The confession only tightened the noose, her own words serving as the most damning testimony against her. Every detail she had given lined up with the forensic evidence investigators had already collected. Yet alongside the certainty of her actions, questions about Cassandra's mental health rose quickly. Her suicide attempt on the same day Marcus's body was discovered could not be ignored. Some wondered if she had been suffering from severe depression or even a deeper psychological break. Could her detachment, her strange presence in the community, have been symptoms of an untreated illness? Defense attorneys signaled early that her mental state would become a focal point of their strategy, arguing that despair and instability clouded her judgment. But for prosecutors, those arguments, while important, were overshadowed by the brutality of what she had done. Depression may explain silence, they said, but it does not excuse execution. Sadness does not load a gun, fire it multiple times, and then finish the job with a knife. The community, too, struggled with this balance. Some asked if Cassandra had been crying for help in ways no one noticed. Others refused to consider her suffering at all, consumed instead by the enormity of Marcus's loss. The debate mirrored what would soon unfold in the courtroom, a battle between explanation and accountability, between the complexity of mental illness and the stark simplicity of murder. But even as those questions swirled, the reality of her confession sat immovable in the center. She had admitted she wanted him dead. She had admitted she pulled the trigger. She had admitted she used the knife when the bullets failed. The upcoming trial promised to reveal more. Prosecutors would lay out the evidence with precision, building a narrative of cold planning and deliberate execution. The defense would attempt to peel back Cassandra's mind, to show cracks in her stability that might soften judgment. And the community, already raw with grief, would be forced to relive every detail in open court. Suspense grew as the date approached, with families on Lightfoot Drive wondering how justice could ever balance such a loss. In the end, a jury would decide Cassandra's fate, but no verdict could ever restore what was taken on that September night. Marcus Roy loved life. That is the thread that runs through every memory, every story told by his friends, every testimony given in the aftermath of his death. He loved basketball, he loved the rush of a game with his friends. He loved video games, arguments over who was better, and late nights filled with laughter. He loved his friends, and they loved him back. And most of all, he loved tomorrow, the unspoken promise that another day was waiting for him. But tomorrow never came. His laughter, his friendships, his dreams, all were silenced by the one person who was meant to guard them. As Cassandra Roy sits behind bars, the world waits for judgment. A trial looms, carrying with it the weight of evidence, confession, and community expectation. Prosecutors prepare to show her deliberate planning, the retrieval of a weapon days before the murder. Defense attorneys hint at mental illness, a mind unraveling under despair. But beneath the strategy and arguments, one question remains unanswered: what drove her? Was it despair, so deep it blinded her to the value of her own child's life? Or was it cruelty, deliberate and cold, hidden behind years of distance and silence? The answer, even if offered in court, may never satisfy the ache of those left behind. For Marcus's friends, no legal argument can erase the sound of unanswered calls, the memory of dropping him off for the last time, the shock of learning that he would never pick up the phone again. For his community, no verdict can rebuild the trust shattered by the betrayal of a mother's hand. And for the investigators, no sentencing can erase the images of a teenager's body lying in his bed, wounds speaking louder than words ever could. Justice may be served in the courtroom, but peace remains far away, just out of reach. And so we are left with questions that cannot be closed as neatly as a case file. What drives a mother to destroy the very life she once nurtured? How does love twist into violence within the same pair of hands? And can any courtroom verdict ever bring peace to the silence left behind? These questions do not belong only to this family, or this neighborhood. They belong to all of us, haunting the edges of what we believe about safety, about family, about trust. In the quiet suburb of St. Charles, one home became more than a crime scene. It became a symbol of trust broken, of innocence lost, of the chilling truth that danger sometimes lives where we least expect it. Curtains once drawn to keep out the world now conceal a silence that will never be lifted. Friends still pass by, remembering the boy who loved life, and neighbors still struggle to make sense of what happened behind that door. The house stands, but the life inside it does not. And tonight, its silence still echoes.
Welcome to Shocking True Crime. Thanks to all our viewers and subscribers for your support. Stay with us for daily updates on the most shocking true crime stories. Don't forget to subscribe.